African culture is diverse, rich, and ancient, influencing the world in numerous ways, from art and music to politics and fashion. The global celebration of African culture and heritage continues to gain momentum, with several countries actively participating in events, awareness campaigns, and recognition of Africa's influence. In this video, we are exploring the top 10 countries that not only celebrate African culture, but also make tangible efforts to preserve and promote it. These countries, alongside some prominent African nations, actively celebrate African culture through festivals, education, and community engagement. It sheds light on how these global hubs are contributing to the recognition and celebration of African traditions and how they support the African diaspora in preserving and promoting their cultural legacies. 1. United States. While not a part of Africa, the United States has one of the largest African diasporas in the world, making its role in celebrating African culture significant. From Black History Month in February to African American cultural centers in cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and Atlanta, the U.S. has worked hard to acknowledge and celebrate African heritage. African American music, such as jazz, hip-hop, and blues, has had a profound influence on the American cultural landscape, and institutions like the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture ensure that African culture is preserved and shared. Additionally, many cities host annual celebrations, such as the National Black Arts Festival in Atlanta, which highlights African American contributions to the arts. 2. United Kingdom. The UK has a vibrant African community, with large numbers of people from Nigeria, Ghana, Somalia, and the Caribbean calling it home. The City of London stands out as a cultural epicenter, where African culture is celebrated through music, theater, and festivals, such as the Notting Hill Carnival. This carnival, one of Europe's largest street festivals, is a celebration of Caribbean and African culture, with music, dancing, and food. In addition, African literature, such as the works of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Ben Okri, is widely celebrated, and institutions like the British Museum feature African exhibitions that focus on African history and heritage. The UK also boasts various African art galleries, such as the Africa Centre in London, dedicated to promoting and preserving African cultural history. 3. France. France has long had historical ties to Africa, particularly through its colonial past. However, in recent years, the country has worked to celebrate and acknowledge the contributions of African culture, especially through its growing African diaspora. Paris, with its large West African community, is a hotspot for African music, fashion, and food. Cultural events such as the Fête de la Musique, celebrating African music, and the African Film Festival in Paris serve as platforms for African culture to flourish. The African Museum in Paris is dedicated to African art and history, showcasing the deep-rooted connection between Africa and France. France's commitment to recognizing its African heritage is further exemplified by the French government's support for the Institute of African Studies, which works to promote African culture, history, and language. 4. Canada, with its diverse multicultural population, celebrates African culture through a variety of channels. Toronto and Montreal, two of Canada's largest cities, are home to vibrant African communities, which organize cultural events throughout the year. One of the key events is Caravana, an annual Caribbean carnival that features African Caribbean culture through music, dance, and food. Canada's commitment to multiculturalism is evident in its recognition of African culture through official channels and events like Black History Month. The Canadian government, alongside many nonprofit organizations, also supports African heritage festivals and initiatives to encourage the exploration of African cultural contributions to Canadian society. Museums such as the Canadian Museum for Human Rights showcase African culture's role in the global narrative, emphasizing the need for the celebration and preservation of African heritage. 5. Australia. Australia, traditionally not as closely associated with African culture as other countries, has seen a growing recognition of African heritage in recent years. With an increasing African immigrant population, particularly from Somalia and Sudan, the African influence is slowly becoming more prominent. Cities like Melbourne and Sydney are now home to cultural events such as African music and dance festivals, alongside a growing number of African Australian artists. While Australia's celebration of African culture may not be as entrenched as other nations, the country is making strides in recognizing the contributions of African communities to its multicultural fabric. African cuisine, music, and traditions are increasingly reflected in Australian culture, and events like the African-Australian Festival in Melbourne have helped amplify African voices and foster a deeper understanding of the continent's heritage. 6. South Africa. South Africa is often hailed as a leader in celebrating African culture, both domestically and internationally. With 11 official languages and a vibrant mixture of ethnic groups, South Africa serves as the epitome of African unity. The nation commemorates African traditions, dance, music, and art, often through festivals like the National Arts Festival and the Cape Town International Jazz Festival. The government has made significant strides in the recognition of African heritage, and South Africa is home to many museums dedicated to preserving African history, such as the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg and the Iziko South African Museum. Internationally, South Africa stands as a beacon for African heritage, actively encouraging African diaspora communities to reconnect with their roots. 7. Nigeria. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, is a major contributor to the celebration of African culture. With over 250 ethnic groups, including the Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo, Nigeria's rich tapestry of cultures is celebrated across the globe. The Lagos Carnival, one of the largest in Africa, is a colorful display of Nigerian music, dance, and food. The country's thriving Nollywood film industry also plays a huge role in promoting African stories to international audiences. Moreover, Nigeria has a long tradition of preserving African heritage through its art, music, and oral history. The National Museum in Lagos and the Owo Museum provide deep insights into the country's past, from its ancient kingdoms to the rich history of its indigenous people. 8. Kenya. Kenya is home to more than 40 ethnic groups, each with its own unique language, traditions, and cultural practices. The Masai Mara National Reserve, for instance, draws thousands of tourists who come to experience the indigenous Masai culture, while the Gikuyu and Kikuyu people, who have their own historical significance, keep their traditions alive through festivals and cultural exchanges. Kenya's strong sense of African heritage is reflected in the celebration of events such as Mashujaa Day, which honors the country's heroes, and the Swahili Festival, celebrating the influence of the Swahili people along the East African coast. 9. Brazil. Brazil's African heritage is deep and long-standing due to the forced migration of African slaves over the centuries. Today, the African influence is present in almost every aspect of Brazilian culture, from its food, music, and dance to its religious practices. The city of Salvador, in particular, is considered the heart of Afro-Brazilian culture, with annual events like the Festival of Yamanja and the Bahian Carnival drawing large crowds to celebrate African traditions. Capoeira, a Brazilian martial art with African origins, and samba music and dance also have their roots in African culture, making Brazil one of the most prominent countries in terms of African cultural integration. 10. Ghana is often referred to as the gateway to Africa due to its rich history as a center of trade, culture, and civilization. The country actively celebrates its African heritage through the Pana Fest, Pan-African Historical Festival, and the Emancipation Day celebrations, which honor the memory of those who fought against slavery. Ghana's strong African identity is reflected in its music, art, and festivals, making it one of the most significant nations in terms of promoting African culture. These countries, among others, are at the forefront of celebrating African culture, heritage, and history. They not only acknowledge the profound impact that Africa has had on global civilization, but also actively promote it through festivals, cultural exchanges, and educational initiatives. The growing recognition and celebration of African culture is a testament to its lasting impact and ongoing relevance on the world stage. As Africa's influence continues to grow, it is essential that these countries maintain and expand their efforts to preserve and celebrate the vibrant cultures that have shaped much of the world's history.